Okay, well, welcome everybody to a special lecture, which is funded by the Association for Korean Studies in Europe for week 11 of our class, Political Economy of Korean Development at the University of Edinburgh. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Juliette Schwak, who is Assistant Professor of International Relations and Political Science at Franklin University in Switzerland. Before taking up her current post, Dr. Schwak was Assistant Professor of International Political Economy at Tokyo International University, and she received her PhD from the City University of Hong Kong, and she has also spent extended periods of time in South Korea, the Philippines, and Japan, which is evident in the case studies and interviews she uses in her research. Dr. Schwak specializes in international political economy, which she approaches from an interdisciplinary perspective, combining methodological and theoretical instruments from sociology, anthropology, and critical theory. And her areas of research include everyday political economy, promotional politics and nation branding, and global development studies. She's working on a monograph on the everyday politics of economic competitiveness in South Korea and the extension of competition as a driving principle in Korean society, which I very much look forward to reading when it comes out. But she's here today to talk about another topic that she has published extensively on, namely the question of development in the South Korean political economy and the ways in which South Korea markets itself as a model of development. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Schwak for what will no doubt be a fascinating lecture. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Steffens, for having me here. And I'm happy to be able to share some findings from my research with all of you. I'm going to share my screen, so I hope this works. This should work. All right. So as Dr. Steffens was saying in our kind introduction, I have indeed worked quite extensively over the last few years on how Korea markets itself as a model of development in the global south. And so I'm going to look at some of the policies and the characteristics of the policies that Korea has implemented to promote itself as a model of development. And I'm going to look at the tensions and contradictions that characterize these series of efforts to promote Korea as a model of development. And so I'm going to start today's lecture with a brief reminder, and I'm sure you are already well acquainted with the scholarly debates surrounding Korea's development, but I'll start with a brief reminder. And then I'll talk more about how Korea has become an aid donor and its ascension, its rapid and rather successful ascension on the international development scene. Before focusing on the so-called Korean model of development, and really this should be between quotation marks, right? Because we're going to talk about the way in which this is very much the product, right, of a political strategy, which will then lead me to explore whether there is a gap between the narratives, right, the promotional narratives underpinning Korea's export of its development model and the realities not only of that model, but also of the kind of policy prescriptions that Korea exhorts developing countries to follow. And finally, I wanted to do something a bit more timely, perhaps, which is looking at how Korea is, the Korean administration, the Moon Jae-in administration, in the context of the COVID pandemic, has attempted to export its own COVID management strategy under the name of K-quarantine. And as I will argue, the export of K-quarantine is actually quite a good illustration of the features and the tensions that we see throughout Korea's efforts to export its model of development. So let's start with a little reminder of the scholarship explaining Korea's development. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the history of that development, and as you know, in the aftermath of the Korean War, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, and underwent several decades of very rapid economic growth, but also political and social modernization. Now, of course, scholars have tried to understand the kind of recipe, right, behind what the World Bank has called the East Asian miracle, and here particularly the so-called miracle on the Han River, right, of Korea's dramatic development. And so we have a series of explanations that compete in the literature. A neoliberal explanation, right, best represented perhaps by the World Bank's 1993 report. We have the developmental state approach that has become quite prominent in the literature. We have scholars who emphasize the role played by culture, and of course, particularly of Confucianism as a kind of an East Asian version of Weber's Protestant ethic. We have scholars who emphasize the geopolitical context, right, and particularly, of course, US support, right, that Korea received during the Cold War. And then we have scholars that have made the perhaps a bit more controversial argument that it was also the legacy of Japanese colonization that enabled Korea to industrialize and modernize in the second half of the 20th century. Now, all these explanations, to a greater or a lesser extent, recognize that the state, that the Korean state was instrumental in bringing about economic development. That said, since the 1990s and kind of concomitant to democratization, we see some changes in Korea's political economy. And these changes that were particularly acute and visible in the post-Asian financial crisis context, so post-1997, have led scholars to debate whether Korea has become neoliberal, whether the Korean state has become a neoliberal state, or whether we instead see a continuity of developmentalism in Korea's political economy. And so that's an ongoing debate that is reflected in the tensions and contradictions that characterize Korea's development assistance policies. Because indeed, Korea has made early efforts to bank upon its own experience of development and share it with developing countries. So it has quite a long history, actually, of training developing countries' officials since the 1960s, when Korea used US aid funding to organize training programs. In 1982, the Korean Development Institute organized an exchange program to receive local officials from developing countries in Korea to learn about Korea's experience. The landmark date, one of the landmark dates, is perhaps 1991, when the Korean International Cooperation Agency, KOICA, was created, and that really signaled Korea's ambition to become an aid donor. But of course, that was in a situation in which Korea was still an aid recipient, because it had actually received very large amounts of aid, particularly from the United States in the aftermath of the Korean War. And so in 2000, it was actually removed from the OECD DAC list of ODA recipients. And here I'm going to make a very small parenthesis to just clarify the terms DAC and ODA for those who might not be familiar with these two terms. So ODA is a specific type of foreign aid. It's official development assistance, specific type of foreign aid that is only provided by those countries that are members of the OECD Development Assistance Committee. The Development Assistance Committee is a club of aid donors that are all OECD members, and whose aid provision corresponds or responds to a series of guidelines. And so it's monitored, it's through a peer review process conducted by the organization, so that it conforms to a series of guidelines, and therefore providing ODA, right, and being a member of the DAC is actually very prestigious, right? So it's actually something that states like Korea have thought to achieve, because of the legitimacy that it provides to their aid policies, but also because of the international prestige that a membership in the DAC grants. And indeed, just 10 years after being removed from the list of recipients, Korea became the last and 24th member of the DAC under the presidency of Lee Myung-bak. Which was an achievement, a definite achievement, in the sense that Korea is the only country that has gone from being an aid recipient to being an aid donor. Now, in the course of 2010, so the presidency of Lee Myung-bak was very active in terms of turning Korea into an aid donor. In July 2010, there was a basic law for international development cooperation that was passed, and whose aim was to create a regulatory framework to enable Korea's development policies. This was also followed in October 2010 by the publication by the government of a strategic plan for international development cooperation. And its purpose was to coordinate initiatives and ensure that Korea had the right capacities to be a development assistance provider. And here, if we look specifically at what the plan states as its purpose, we already see some of the elements that I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. The plan states that it aims to systematically document the development contents of successes and failures of Korea's development experience, strengthening ODA, right, implementing capacities, and taking a proactive role in addressing global issues. So what do we see when we look at the plan? We see the intention of building a model through a systematic collection of data based on Korea's development experience. And we also see, of course, the international ambition of Korea to become a leader in international development assistance. Now, if we look a little bit at figures, just to give you an idea of how Korean ODA works, Korean ODA provision has been continuously increasing since 2010, so since the government, since the first year in which Korea provided official ODA. The percentage, the proportion of ODA that is provided with respect to the gross national income is lower than most members of the OECD DAC. However, Korea has made significant efforts to increase its budget and to invest in ODA since it became a member of the DAC. Korea provides two types of ODA: grants and humanitarian assistance that is provided by the Korean International Cooperation Agency, KOICA, which is under the authority of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then it also provides loans, and loans are under or provided by the Economic Development Cooperation Fund, which is under the authority of the Ministry of Strategy and Finance. Now, why is that important? It's not only if you like, a bureaucratic detail, right, or technical question. We have within Korean ODA two agencies that respond to two different logics. One that is the logic of the MOFA, right, of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs through KOICA, that is much more, that coincides with what we could call a liberal understanding of foreign aid. That is, foreign aid being given mostly for humanitarian purposes, whereas in the context of the Ministry of Strategy and Finance, it's very clear that the Economic Development and Cooperation Fund operates according to Korea's economic interests. So we have not only a distinction in bureaucratic terms, but also a distinction in terms of institutional philosophies or institutional cultures, in terms of what ODA actually responds to. And this is, of course, reflected in the type of ODA that is provided by the two organizations. Now, if we look a bit at where Korea sends ODA, we see that most of its ODA goes to Asia, and that's particularly Southeast Asia. Some of its top recipients include countries like Vietnam or Cambodia, for instance. There's an increasing focus on Africa, particularly with a program that I'll discuss in a few minutes, the New Village movement. And what we see is that Korea tends to give ODA mostly to middle-income countries rather than least developed countries, which is not something that the OECD DAC is particularly pleased about, but it is actually what we find if we dig a little deeper in where Korea sends ODA. In terms of the kind of programs, the kind of projects that it finances, we see that Korean ODA has been mostly focused on infrastructure projects. In order to, the philosophy behind it is to create local growth potential. And so that translates into, for instance, the construction and the financing of airports or roads or ports in Southeast Asia, for instance. That's a common sight across East Asia, to have a kind of a label or a plaque acknowledging Korea's support in building a road or a bridge or an airport. Now, that said, recently there's been an increased focus on humanitarian projects in health and education. And here, interestingly, and maybe this is something that we can talk about in the Q&A, Korea actually seems to be following the experience of Japan in kind of moving from a very commercial form of aid to more humanitarian assistance. So that's not a trend that is entirely new. As we've seen from the strategic plan, Korea also has the ambition to become a leader in international development governance. And it took a series of steps in order to assert its authority on the international development scene, with the hosting of the Seoul G20 summit in 2010, which focused the agenda of the summit was development, and the Korean government pushed hard to put development at the center of discussions. Korea then hosted a high-level forum on aid effectiveness in 2011 in Busan. That's a summit that gathers most of the most prominent actors of international development governance, both international organizations and, for the first time in Busan, civil society organizations. What these international efforts to promote Korea's ODA and background, right, in development have resulted in quite an interest for a Korean model of development in Southeast Asia, particularly in Africa, a bit perhaps more and more. And this was also because South Korea's efforts have been endorsed by international organizations like the UNDP or the Asian Development Bank, organizations that have been very interested in the Korean development model. And so, of course, want to now spend a few minutes talking about this model. This model has been produced by a series of government and government-affiliated agencies based on Korea's development experience. And the idea that that underpins this production is that this model of development, identifying a model of development, is a competitive advantage for Korea in a development scene that is functioning more and more like a market, right? In which we have a lot of competition between donors, because developing countries have more and more agency over who they want to partner with. And so the idea of a South Korean model of development is the result of dialogues between the Korean Development Institute, the Korean Institute for International Economic Policy, and the Korean Educational Development Institute. So government and government-affiliated research centers, essentially. And so the Korean model is the result of this political construction, which is essentially a selection of characteristics from Korea's development history that can be turned into a replicable model. It's interesting to note that academics were also actually involved in this process of defining what the Korean model of development is. Now, what these efforts translated into was a series of training programs, right, for foreign officials in which they were invited to learn about this Korean model of development. But also from 2004, and that's an important date, the creation of Korea's knowledge sharing program, which was created by the KDI, the Korean Development Institute, and the Ministry of Finance and Strategy. And the goal of the program is to transfer macroeconomic knowledge from Korea to developing countries. So it's part of what we call development assistance, but it goes much beyond foreign aid, right? In the sense that it's not financial assistance, it's rather intellectual assistance. The KSP consists mainly of policy consultations and modularization projects based on Korea's development experience. And I'll say a bit more about the KSP in a few minutes. Now, of course, in political economic terms, what is this Korean model of development? Right? What are its contents? What that model is actually an object of debates between bureaucrats. So there's no clear consensus within Korean policymaking circles as to what this model actually is. And the debate really centers around a contrast between the neoliberal explanation of Korea's development and the developmental state approach. That's been even more the case that there's this debate between the role of the market or the role of the state, because you had, since the early 1990s, the rise of US-trained neoliberal bureaucrats in Korea. If you're interested in this question, this is something that Ian Peary discusses very well in his work on financial liberalization in Korea. So we have something that is quite a bone of contention between bureaucrats. That said, in its promotion, in its external promotion, the Korean state usually promotes its experience as a developmental state because it can promote this as unique. And we can discuss, actually, I think it's important to discuss whether it is actually unique when we talk about the limits of this model. What this means is that Korea puts a lot of emphasis on national ownership of development projects. And here on the slide, you have a picture of a POSCO plant, right? POSCO being this national champion in the steel industry that Park Chung-hee decided to invest in against the advice of all international, well, not only international consultants, but also foreign governments. So you have an emphasis on being of retaining ownership of development goals and plans. You have, of course, a discourse surrounding, or rather a narrative surrounding Korea's recent experience of lifting itself out of poverty, right, which is promoted as an asset of the Korean development model. The promotion of this model also relies on an anti-colonial rhetoric, which is building upon the shared history of colonialism that Korea has in common with many developing countries, and which interestingly is a rhetoric that is very similar to the rhetoric that China also uses to promote its own foreign aid projects. Now, part of the Korean development model focuses on one flagship program, which I know some of you are particularly interested in, which is the Semaolondong program, right? Which is the New Village movement, which was a rural development program implemented in the 1970s. To bridge the rural-urban income gap. So essentially the situation was that villages were lagging behind Korea's industrialization, in terms of industrialization, lagging behind the cities. And so the Korean government initiated a program of village beautification and modernization. And so here you see, this is I'm sharing now a few pictures that I took on a visit at the Korea Semaolondong Museum a few years ago. This is what a Korean village looked like before Semaolondong, and this is what it's supposed to look like afterwards. So it's been modernized, right? Now, since the presidency of Im Yoon-bak, and still today, and that's a bit surprising, under Moon Jae-in, the Korean government has made efforts to export Semaolondong. And it's been helped by the fact that many international organizations, the UNDP, the UNESCO, just to name a few, and academics, prominent academics like Jeffrey Sachs, for instance, have been acclaiming Semaolondong, right, and really supporting its export and its translation into a kind of an actionable model of development for rural communities in the global south. Under President Park Geun-hye, it became the flagship movement of Korean ODA because, of course, of her personal legacy. And so it's actually surprising that this export of Semaolondong continues under Moon Jae-in. Now, regardless, a series of events have been organized to promote Semaol, a series of global fora, training programs at the Korea Semaol Center and other institutions. So here on the slide, you have a picture still from my museum visit of the certificate that developing countries officials receive when they complete their training. And here you have the map that shows the expansion of Semaolondong in the 21st century around the world. Now, if we look at who is in charge of Semaolondong initiatives in the developing world, we see that it's actually a web of actors that all have their individual initiatives, and very often it doesn't seem very coherent from a strategic point of view. So it seems to go a little bit in different directions. What Semaolondong means for different actors is not always exactly the same thing. So there's a bit of a strategic incoherence. And I'll come back on this because I actually think there is a coherence behind these seemingly kind of scattered activities. Now, regardless, Semaolondong has received enthusiastic praise from leaders in different developing countries, in Rwanda, for instance, or in Cambodia, where you have Semaol villages being implemented currently. And I've done some research on Semaolondong programs in the Philippines, which I'll be happy to discuss in the Q&A. Now, if we look at the Korean model of development in terms of realities, because I think there are two scales. There's the scale of the promotional narratives, and then there's the reality. Now, in Korea, civil society organizations and academics are often very critical of Korea's development assistance, and particularly of its attempt to create a model. They argue that it's one size fits all, right? So it might not be replicable, it might not apply to non-Korean context. They argue that sometimes this idea of the Korean model favors authoritarianism because, of course, it's a model that relies on the legacy and perhaps the mythicized legacy of Park Chung-hee. They argue that it's, and that's more kind of a liberal, I would say liberal left argument in Korea, that Korean ODA policies are commercial, that they are driven by business interests, and that they disregard human and environmental rights. Now, beyond these criticisms, of course, what we see in the promotion, in the narrative, is that Korea is quite exceptional, and that's what it banks upon to promote its model. But if we look at the history of Korean development, we see that the so-called developmental state was actually very much a product of its time. If we look at global political economy in the first decades following World War II, in which it's not only in Korea, and it's not even only in East Asia, that the state is considered instrumental in economic policies, of course, from the Keynesian welfare states of Western Europe to of course the communist states that were also very attractive in many parts of the newly decolonized world. So we have both a global political economic context that kind of tones down this exceptionality, and of course the geopolitical situation in which Korea and other and neighboring countries like Taiwan found themselves, in which of course they were provided with US support, and that can also seems to limit the possibility of exporting a model of a specifically Korean model of development. Now, I think beyond these points, what is perhaps most interesting is that Korean development assistance organizations promote, right, in their narratives, the developmental state approach, right, and the legacy of the developmental state. But in reality, if we look at the kind of prescriptions that they share with developing countries today, we see that what they do is actually promote neoliberal policies, and that are very much at odds with Korea's own history of economic development. And so what I did, and this is extracted from one of the papers that I shared ahead of today's talk, was look at reports by the knowledge sharing program, which were requested for partner countries. So partner countries get in touch with the Ministry of Strategy and Finance and ask for these reports. And then the reports are produced by a variety of different actors, public research or policy institutes like KOSHRA, the Trade Promotion Agency of Korea, independent research institutes, sometimes private consultancies, or even individual experts, could be academics, for instance. Some of these reports are also produced and together with international organizations. And so what I found by looking at the detailed contents of these reports is that Korean development assistance organizations are promoting a few elements of developmentalism, by, for instance, arguing that developing states should implement industrial policies or invest in infrastructure projects. But mostly what we see is the exhortation to implement neoliberal policies, that is, developing public-private partnerships, attracting foreign direct investment, promoting entrepreneurship, concluding free trade agreements, internationalizing SMEs, implementing reforms to make their regulatory environments more open and attractive to business. And so overall, we have prescriptions that encourage private instead of public development financing, that encourage SMEs and startups rather than national champions, that encourage free trade rather than protectionism, which is and that's really at odds with the kind of neo-mercantilist policies of developmental Korea. And so we have prescriptions that together really put emphasis on market competition. And this corresponds to what people like Henlon or Chang have called kicking away the ladder. That is a situation in which developed countries promote towards developing countries policies that are the very opposite of the policies that enable them to develop in the first place. And so this is exactly what we're seeing. So it's not entirely, and that's one thing that I want to emphasize, is that these findings are actually not particularly surprising. And again, they're not really unique to Korea either. This is also because aid is driven by public-private logics. Now, there was a lot of literature that argued that Korea's aid policies were driven by business interest. There wasn't a lot of research explaining exactly how and why this was the case. And so I did some work a few years ago to look at whether and then how Korean conglomerates in particular, the chaebol, were integrated in policy formulation and delivery in ODA. And so what I found was that due to their structural power in Korea's economy, the chaebol are included informally, they're included structurally, they're included institutionally in Korea's ODA. And so mostly ODA projects are very often driven by the market access needs of both the chaebol and the state, because the state has become dependent upon the chaebol. And the chart here that you have, sorry, I couldn't use the colors on the PowerPoint, but shows the Korean stakeholders that were involved in a series of KOICA-funded projects for over the course of a few years. And what I found is that even for KOICA, which is, as I mentioned earlier, an organization that is not driven by commercial logics as much as the Economic Development and Cooperation Fund is, we still have, if we look at its projects, 35% of projects that lists a chaebol as the main partner of KOICA in the delivery of the projects. So we really have a strong inclusion of business actors. What this means, though, is not that Korea is not yet a liberal donor, or that Korea is an abnormal donor, that Korea is particularly corrupted, because this is actually very much in line with global development agendas that have pushed for the inclusion of the private sector in development financing in particular. And so again, an aspect that I think is important to emphasize is this idea of the convergence of Korea being rather more convergent than divergent in terms of following international development norms. Even if we look at Sema-Londong, which I was mentioning earlier, right? We have, and you can see here a little bit on the slide, a multiplicity of different actors. International actors, academic actors, public actors that are participating in its promotion overseas. And so we have what seems to be a strategic incoherence. But actually, and this is an argument that I'm making in a paper that's been accepted but not yet published, I think there's actually a coherence, a political economic logic behind all these different initiatives. And this is what I call the will to compete, that is enrolling subjectivities in capitalist development and extensive or extended processes of primitive accumulation. In other words, integrating rural areas of the developing world in capitalist production relations. And that's very much in line actually with And again, this is this idea of convergence with the neoliberal agendas of the World Bank and other international organizations. If we look at CEMAL programs, we see that they're also very much in line with the state-able kind of nexus and the need for market access. And particularly in CEMAL projects, we have a lot of emphasis today in the way that they are exported on the promotion of agricultural value chains, of integrating rural communities into international agricultural value chains. And these are projects in which very often the chaebol are involved. And so here, for instance, there's a project in Vietnam that is a COICA project. So again, that is coming from an organization that has a more humanitarian approach to ODA. And yet in this kind of project, the major partner of COICA is CJ, which is one of the largest food and beverage companies in Korea. And so here again, we have a form of convergence with international development agendas, which also responds to domestic economic imperatives. Now, all these elements are very clear if we look at something that the Korean government has been trying to do over the last year, which is exporting its COVID response model. Right? And this is interesting, and the reason why I'm talking about it, because it might be a bit anecdotal, but this export of a so-called K-quarantine model contains all the features of the export of the Korean model of development, as I've been kind of highlighting them in this talk. Now, since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, Korea, as you know, has initially been one of the few countries that was successful in limiting the spread of the disease. And actually, many state leaders have turned to the Moon Jae-in government to ask for help, starting with the United States. But we have there are over 100 requests to the Korean government, and so the Korean government has expressed its formula for fighting the disease as TTT: trace, test, and treat. And it's currently devising a strategy to export this approach through a so-called K-quarantine model. Now, the TTT approach refers to the tracing of the contacts of infected patients through ICT, testing on a massive scale, right? You've all seen the pictures of the drive-through and walk-through testing centers in Korea, and isolating, that's the treat part, infected individuals. So what we see in this formula is that, of course, it's very technical. And I think there were actually much more political reasons that also explain Korea's initial success in kind of mitigating the effects of the pandemic, and we can discuss that in the Q&A. But regardless of these political factors, the Korean government is focused on its technical response, of course, to export its model. And so it's taken a series of initiatives to really establish an official model, including all the techniques and all the products used to manage and respond to COVID. So it organized a series of webinars to share its experience with foreign governments. It allocated a budget to the export of the K-quarantine model. And most importantly, and that really shows perhaps something that is even more ambitious in the way that Korea wants to create a model. It has proposed this model, has submitted this model to the ISO, the International Standardization Organization, from as early as April 2020. And so you have several ministries and government agencies that are in charge. And what they did is that they submitted to ISO 18 standards, including the testing methods, like the RT-PCR diagnostic kits, the drive-through and the walk-through testing centers, tracing methods like the mobile self-diagnosis app, and treating methods like non-hospital quarantine centers. So there's really an effort to kind of have an official stamp and recognize the Korean experience here in dealing with COVID as a standard that is regulated and protected by ISO. In addition, KOTRA, the trade agency of Korea, organized an expo in September 2020, which introduced products and technologies related to K-Quarantine to share its model, but also its technologies with buyers, including private buyers, right? So companies, but also, and interestingly, foreign public agencies, public health agencies, and foreign embassies present in Korea. Now, if we look at the export of K-Quarantine, we see that it's actually closely associated with an increase in ODA. From last year, the Ministry of Finance has been allocating more than $400 million for public health projects in the Global South. ODA to Asia, particularly, of course, Southeast Asia, has increased dramatically. And so we have an association of the export of K-Quarantine and of ODA efforts. Right, and so here we have an example of one of the webinars that was organized on standardizing the Korean quarantine model. Now, of course, this decision to export the Korean quarantine model is driven by commercial reasons. And it kind of follows the fact that last year, a series of Korean companies like Seegene, which is a kind of a successful startup in the biomedical sector, were very successful in exporting test kits around the world. And so the Korean International Trade Association, KOTRA, has identified this as a potential kind of window of opportunity to restore Korea's export-oriented industrialization strategy. So the Korean government is trying to capitalize on Korea's response to COVID to open new markets and revive its export-oriented economic strategy. Now, of course, this is again the result of a public-private nexus because the Chaebol have benefited from the pandemic. Samsung Biologics, for instance, has led Korea's pharmaceutical sector during the pandemic and has actually grown wealthier from the pandemic. And of course, this definitely shapes government agenda. And here, this is the result of both past dependency of the developmental state era with public-private coordination, but it's also the result of the neoliberal transition and the competitiveness imperatives that has really made the Chaebol's interest organically present in government economic policies. And so one thing that is always interesting to note is that often we think of the weight of businesses in terms of lobbying, but it is actually here much more than lobbying. It's really structural power in the sense that I think that the Chaebols, they don't even have to lobby the government. They have very institutionalized channels of communication through which their interests are organically taken into account by policymakers. And so this is therefore not very surprising that the Ministry of Finance, for instance, has argued that the private and public sectors will join hands and spare no efforts to recognize that, to have the K-Quarantine model recognized as a global standard. We see that this responds to an export-oriented strategy because KEXIM, the Korea Export-Import Bank, has seen its overseas capital increase over almost 3 times since last year to boost Korea's export. The Ministry of Finance has announced that in parallel to exporting the quarantine model, it's also planning to support Korean companies in winning bids for overseas infrastructure projects. And the Korean Public Procurement Service has signed a memorandum of agreement with the Korea Health Industry Development Institute and the Korean Industry of Procurement in June 2020 to help Korean suppliers that are making K-Quarantine associated products gain more competitiveness in global public procurement markets. Now, the need to restore the export-oriented strategy is, of course, also a response to domestic imperatives, to domestic needs, growth imperatives, right? And we have to remember that the last 3 presidents in Korea have been elected on kind of promises to restore economic growth. And of course, this is even more crucial now with the consequences, the upcoming consequences of the COVID crisis, and so on demand and employment. So there's a clear domestic need, and then of course we have on top of that Chaeble's needs, right, and interest in terms of market access. Now, of course, and that will be my conclusion, and this can be expanded to the discussion on the Korean model of development here. Can the K-quarantine model really be exportable? Well, we've seen that in Korea itself, this model has shown some limits with the recent new waves of the disease. This is a model that relies on very specific public-private synergies that are specific to Korea's development experience, might not be replicable elsewhere. This is a model that focuses a lot, that relies mostly on technology, which means that other countries, and particularly developing countries, would have to rely on foreign and perhaps Korea's technologies and products, so that there's a risk of introducing a dependency here. And of course, we have competition from other countries that have also been very successful at dealing with COVID, perhaps even more successful, actually, Taiwan and New Zealand. And if we just look at Taiwan, it donated masks to the US and Europe. It's been working with the American and Australian government on pandemic prevention. Its exports have also boomed. So there's definitely here again this question of whether the Korean model is really that unique. And so what we see through this this kind of overview that I've shared of Korea's efforts to promote a development model is, of course, that there is something that is unique, which is the fact that Korea is the first recipient turn donor country in the world. But there's, of course, also the question of whether it is really an exceptional model, or whether there is rather a convergence with both in terms of the historical context in which Korea's development took place, but also in terms of the actual policies and policy prescriptions that Korea is sharing with developing countries today. We see also, of course, that public-private interests matter in shaping the export of this model. And so perhaps more broadly, more theoretically, this also reveals that domestic political economy often shapes foreign policy. Very actively shapes foreign policy. And finally, as we've seen, the strategy to export the management of the COVID crisis, I think is a good illustration of these different logics, kind of crystallizes some of the tensions that we see throughout Korea's efforts to share its model with the developing world.